In this video, we're going to work on adding some very iconic graphics to our orange blob enemy. Right now, when we hit the enemy, we don't really get any confirmation that we've dealt damage to him, and we don't get any sort of defeat animation. So what I want to focus on in this video is, I guess, three things. One, getting a hit flash, kind of an iconic red hit flash when we hit the enemy working. And then two, I want to get some kind of defeat animation going when the enemy runs out of hit points. And then three, I want to try to make it so that the stage remembers when an enemy is defeated. So when we leave the stage and come back onto the stage, we could optionally make an enemy not respawn once we've defeated them. So with that, we're going to want to start with creating a hit flash script. And so a hit flash script, the way that I'm going to set this up, I'm going to avoid using any extra variables that we need to do. I'm going to try to make this all self-contained. So let's go into our scripts folder, and we're going to create another one. So we're going to create a script. This will be called scr underscore hit underscore flash. And I'm going to just take this scr prefix off of the title here. So it'll just say function hit flash. So let's knocking over things here with my cat. Decided to join me. All right, so let's actually do some fanciness here. That's actually a very useful thing to use in GameMaker, and that's detecting if a variable exists. So in GameMaker, as you probably have known at this point, it crashes if you attempt to access a variable that hasn't been defined yet. And we're going to be using a hit flash variable to track how long the enemy should be red or not red during this time. So what we want to do is use this command if variable instance exists, ID to refer to the current thing that's executing this script, comma, hit underscore flash underscore count. And so that's checking to see if we have a hit flash variable so that we can actually assign it if we don't. So if we don't have a hit flash counter, we will make the variable called hit flash count so that it exists. That way we don't have to add an extra instance variable because we already have a ton of instance variables on our characters and enemies. So so now this is definitely kind of, as long as we can maintain the state. So I would be interested to see if we don't have a hurt state, what we'll have to do to tweak the code to make it work. Because I'm thinking for the air elemental enemy, I don't have hurt animations for it. So if anim state equals animation state hurt. So we're basically going to hit flash if we're in the hurt animation. Hit flash count plus equals 1. And so this line would have crashed because we're trying to add 1 to hit flash count if we didn't already declare the variable here. So we check to see if the variable exists. If it doesn't, create it and set it to 0. But if it already exists, we don't have any problems here. We would just have a hit flash count. So then if let's write the code to turn the character red from a white state. So basically, if your normal colors, tint red. So if hit flash count equals 8, and I kind of just played around with these numbers to get what looked good. So basically, I'm saying if you've spent 8 frames without a red tint, with the normal white, then tint the character red. So image blend equals cred, hit flash count equals 0, and that resets the hit count. Else if hit flash count equals 4, and we are currently red, just tint back to white. And then lastly, off of this if statement for hurt, and actually this should be all caps. Kind of forgot about that. If we aren't in the hurt state, then if we ended the hurt state while we weren't back to our normal white color, so like if we were red, then it set it back to no tint. And so this will be our hit flash script, and we'll call this inside of our enemy object. We'll probably do it inside the enemy parent, actually, because that's going to be the easiest. So this is all we need to do for this script. We're going to test it in a second. So we're going to jump over to enemy parent, and we want to pull up the step function. So we want to start triggering the hurt animation. So I'm just going to verify that I do have a hurt animation, and I do. So the blob does have a hurt animation defined. So I wanted to do, maybe before we deal with the movement, if hurt is greater than 0, then animate 0, 0, animation state hurt. So basically, if I actually need to remember what that variable is called. We have a variable called stat hurt, and that's a counter for how long the enemy needs to be in the hurt state, and that gets set whenever we get dealt damage by anything really. So like if we get hit by a sword, for instance, our hurt state is getting set to the stun time from the weapon. So basically, if the hurt animation is playing, the thing has no control over its movement, is essentially what we're doing. And then we want to call our hit flash method. So we just have to say hit underscore flash, and that method that we wrote will do all of that work for us. So let's test this. Ideally, what we should be experiencing is when we strike the enemy with any weapon, it should blink red and actually have like that little hurt animation. But we don't have a defeated thing yet. So we got our first step done. We've got the enemy doing its red hurt flash. So the second part, we want to make it so that the enemy has some kind of death animation. Now, what we've set up basically just stops the enemy. Right now, when the hit points reach 0, we just set slain to be true. And when it's slain, some of its other behaviors stop. So we want to try to call a slain animation. So what we'll do here, do I have the attack enabled variable yet? We do have attack enabled. So while we're here, we will stop any attacks. So we'll say attack enabled equals false. You cannot attack when you're slain. And then we want to play the defeat animation. So we'll say animate 0, 0, animation states slain. Lock the animation. So we'll say anim locked. So no other animations can get set. And that should be all we need there. But this isn't going to do anything. This is just setting up the infrastructure if our characters have a slain animation, but our slime doesn't. And so this will help us down the road for other actors, but not for the slime. So if we want to have a unique behavior for only the slime, that's where overriding these inherited methods is going to come in. So we're going to want to actually give the slime a new end step method. So we're going to click on add event, step, end step. And we want to describe what this is going to do. So so it's going to play the normal end step, but also delete self. So to do that, we'll call the parent's end step by using event inherited. So we're going to guarantee that this runs first. So if the slime runs out of hit points, all of these things and all the stats and all the hurt things are still going to get triggered, because when we have this end step here, it replaces the old one. So by saying event inherited, that's kind of like using super in like Java and C. It's going to call this and run this code, and then we can add on to it with our own unique stuff. So unique to the blob, when HP is 0, make a puff of smoke and deletes the blob. We need to create the puff of smoke actor, but so we'd say if hit points is less than or equal to 0 and slain is true. Remember, this is happening after the other code, so slain will get set to true. We want to delete instance underscore destroy. We want to delete the blob. So this should work. We should actually see now when we hit the blob and it runs out of hit points, it will disappear. And all the other stuff should happen. Oops. I think I forgot the names of my variables. So stat HP and stat slain. That's what happens when you start overcomplicating your names of your variables, is you tend to forget that you are trying to be organized with your variable names. All right, so now when we hit the blob on our 4th hit, it disappears. And that's what we want. And now let's throw like a little puff of smoke so it's a little bit more satisfying than just purely disappearing. That's, not very rewarding for the player. So we're going to need to create a new effect set of sprites, and then we're going to need to make a new like smoke puff. So under effects, we're going to create a new sprite. And we're going to call this SPR underscore smoke. We're going to go to import. And that is under the effects set here. And I have a smoke effect sprite sheet. And there's 2 different ones. I'm going to use the first one here. Now, I don't want it like this. I need to cut this up into individual frames. So I'm just going to go to edit image, and then the image option, convert to frames. Now I need to make sure I set this to the right size. I believe this was 96 by 90. Nope. It's going to be 128 by 128. And I think it's 10 frames. Let's make sure by just bumping this down to 9. And we can see that yeah, that worked. The 10th frame is right there. And that's all we need to do. We hit convert. And now this will be a 10 frame animation. I don't really need to make any changes here. I do need to center it. As for the size, this is a little bit big. So I'm going to drop this down to 64 by 64. And I'm going to change the FPS of its animation to 10 frames per second. That's all the stuff that we're going to do with that sprite. Now we're going to make an actor for it. Honestly, we could just duplicate the blob, or I'm sorry, the spark for it, and because it's going to use all the same exact stuff. So I'm just going to duplicate the spark and call this object smoke. And it's going to have the same begin step. It's going to have the same animation end. The only thing that's different is we're going to use a different sprite. All right. So that should be good. Now let's add that into our hit points as 0 for the blob. So here we want to tell it to spawn that puff of smoke right before we delete it. So instance underscore creates layer x comma y, the blob's position, the layer, call it instances, which is just that default name, and then object smoke. And then that will create the little puff of smoke when we defeat this thing. So when we strike the blob, that is actually intended that the axe has like a miss zone like right next to you. And so we've got that cool little effect when we hit this thing. Now that is part 2. Part 3 is to make them stay dead. So we want to be able to have certain enemies, particularly bosses, not respawn. So after we defeat the enemy and then we zone out or something, much like the weapons, when we pick them up, we want them to delete. We want the enemy to not respawn after we've defeated the enemy. So the good news is that's actually not too terribly complex thing to do. So if we go over to our enemy parent, we will need a new variable for this. And incidentally, I think it's kind of hard for me to fit it into any of these existing categories. I don't think it's an AI thing. So I'll just call this, and I've struggled with what I should call this, AI underscore allow respawn. So this is going to be, do we allow this thing to respawn? We're going to go with true for the default there. Now, I feel like because this is something we're going to change pretty often, we might want to kick it up towards the top of this variable definition list. So it's going to pop up right at that top part. Because the player is not going to be really tweaking. I mean, maybe like per instance, obviously. So we just put it to the top so that way it's easy to access. So if we're not allowing it to be respawned, so that's going to be an end step thing, like right when we're getting defeated. Right after this animation lock, if we'll use the exclamation for not, if not AI underscore allow respawn, So we want to add it to our data um, map, our data like storage. And so if we recall, that was called um, Global Manager Data Permanence was our name of our thing, which again, not the greatest name in the world. Um, but that's what I picked. So we want to say ds map underscore add global dot manager dot data permanence comma id, which so we're inserting the monster's id, and then we're inserting defeated. And id, so this id here, just to kind of point out what that really is doing, each enemy and each thing has an instance id. So like you see here that all these have like a unique kind of like memory address, and that's going to be the ID that it inserts there. So each one of these blobs has a unique name inside of GameMaker already. And so that is instance 79A820A5. If I was to delete this and put a new blob in, it would get a different instance name, but that's its ID. And so we add that in as the key, and we add in the value of defeated. So when the room loads, we can go through and check to see if any of the enemies have been set to defeated in the map, and if so, just delete them. So let's go and do that. It's actually a pretty easy thing to, now that we've already set up a huge infrastructure for doing this. So this is going to be pretty quick. So we jump over to Game Manager, and we want the room start. And we're going to actually just steal the code. I'm going to take this delete items we've picked up code, and we're just going to modify that for doing the same thing for enemies. So we're just putting it at the end here. I'll just call it like 3.3. Delete enemies that aren't supposed to respawn. So instead of object item, we're going to search for object enemy parents. And again, this is a really great use of inheritance. No matter how many enemies we end up making, if they're children of enemy parents, then they will show up in this list. And that's exactly what we want. Get a reference to the object enemy. So we'll just take this thing, put it here. We don't need to check to see if it was set to not respawn, because it's only going to have an entry if it wasn't supposed to respawn. So if we're checking the map using that question mark syntax, thing.id equals defeated. So then we'll find it and set it to deleted. So keep in mind, our enemies are defaulting to, the default behavior is to allow respawn. So we will have to go through and tell specific enemies that we don't want it to respawn. So like if we jump over to room 1 here, maybe let's tell this blob that we're going to override the default value here, and we're going to uncheck that. So this blob is set to not allow respawning. This one is set to allow respawning. So the right blob will stay defeated. The left blob will come back whenever we zone back into this room. So let's go poke us a blob. So we're going to defeat both blobs with the inefficient spear. And then we're going to zone out. And then when we zone back in, notice that the one that we said that was not allowed to respawn has stayed dead, but yet this other one came back. So now we can use this to make certain enemies stay defeated. So like major bosses or major enemies that the player should only really need to defeat once, uh, won't come back if we zone back into that area. And that's going to really wrap up this video. So we've done our three things. We've got the hit flash, we've got the smoke puff, and we've got respawning. In the next video will be the last thing we need for the blob, and that is going to be getting it to attack us so that it can bite us. So that's going to be the focus of the next video, and after that we'll move on to a ranged enemy, and we'll start setting up an air elemental that will shoot little lightning bolts at us. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video for blob attacks.